Indonesian police and fishermen have begun patrols on the shores of Aceh province to prevent Rohingya refugees from arriving from Bangladesh. The past few weeks have seen hundreds arrive in rickety boats from refugee camps in Cox's Bazaar to Aceh province. Here, an initial welcome by Indonesians is slowly wearing thin. DW correspondent Sharon Sumolang reports.
Relief after 14 days at sea. Together with some 200 other Rohingya migrants, Shahid and his family have just arrived in Aceh, Indonesia's most western province. They are now being held in a temporary shelter in PD, not far from where their boat landed.
When I was on the boat, it was pouring with rain. The wind was blowing hard too. Everyone got wet. When the sun came out, our clothes got dry. It went on like that, over and over again. I was afraid the boat would sink. I just prayed that we could land somewhere.
The Rohingyas are a Muslim minority who fled from Myanmar to neighboring Bangladesh. Shahid and his family arrived in a Bangladesh camp 11 years ago. But the conditions in the camp were becoming so inhumane that Shahid's mother and her 3 sons risked the perilous crossing to Indonesia, a journey that almost cost them their lives.
If we had stayed on that boat for another 1 or 2 days, my children would probably have died. We hadn't eaten anything for 10 days. I prayed to God that if somebody had to die, let it be me, not my children.
Until now, the people of Aceh have mostly welcomed Rohingya refugees. But recently, the number of arrivals has risen dramatically, increasing tensions in the region. This boat at Biren Beach, carrying hundreds of migrants, was pushed back to sea twice before finally being allowed to land after a 3rd attempt.
Yes, I hope they go back to their own country. I don't want them to move to other parts of Aceh. We hope the local government or central government can guard the sea so that the Rohingya that want to enter Aceh are not left unescorted.
Back at the PD shelter, some 140 kilometers away, Shahid's mother and her sons are hoping the local government will let them and their fellow refugees stay. As night falls, the local fishermen report that another 2 boats were spotted at sea.
And for more, we are joined by Deputy Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, Phil Robertson. Phil, what is making Indonesians on Aceh so resistant to accepting Rohingya refugees?
Well, I think the local authorities are tired, in part because they've been getting little or no support from the national government in Jakarta, which has been consistently shirking its duties towards receiving refugees and asylum seekers. So the Acehnese have been on their own for quite some time, and actually even some got prosecuted for helping Rohingya boat people in the past. So I think right now it's a reaction as much towards the Rohingya as to the national government in Indonesia, which has consistently been a difficult partner that has, been more inclined to think about pushing boats off rather than helping them.
But Phil, Indonesia isn't a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Could Jakarta simply say it won't accept any more Rohingya refugees and still legally be correct?
Well, I mean, they would be legally correct and morally wrong. There is a expectation and a moral duty for governments to receive people in distress on the sea. And, the fishermen of Aceh understand that. It's a puzzle to us why the government of Indonesia doesn't understand it. The interesting thing here is that in many of these people who arrive actually in Aceh from Rakhine State, the Rohingya who are there, don't actually end up staying in Aceh long term. Many of them in turn will leave Indonesia and go to Malaysia because that's where they're trying to get to. So it's very, very disturbing that Indonesia is taking this kind of attitude because, with Thailand pushing Rohingya off and Malaysia pushing Rohingya off, there's no other place for these boats to go. Indonesia and Aceh are the last hope of the Rohingya.
And many of these Rohingya are fleeing squalid conditions in camps in Bangladesh. But this is an old issue. Why does it continue to remain a problem?
Well, it's quite clear that the Myanmar military junta has no interest in having those Rohingya who are in the camps ever return to Myanmar. They have continuously made it almost impossible for the Rohingya to consider going back there because they don't feel safe. You know, they don't want to go back under the control of a military that committed crimes against humanity and acts of genocide against them, just 7 or 8 years ago. So ultimately, the Rohingya are stuck in these camps. The Bangladesh government doesn't want them and is trying to pressure them to go back and making their life miserable in the process. And the violence is increasing in those camps. There's a sense of lawlessness that has certainly taken hold that the Bangladesh authorities are doing very little to combat.
Repatriation of Rohingya refugees back to Myanmar has been long touted as a long-term solution, and you just had the news that China has brokered a new repatriation plan. But when you say that Myanmar is not serious about having the Rohingya back, does that mean that any talk of a repatriation plan is essentially pointless?
Well, I think they can have the talks, but ultimately what the Rohingya expect is to be able to return to their villages, to be able to return with full rights as citizens of Myanmar, not displaced persons or stateless persons. And they want to have freedom of movement, they want to have right to livelihoods, and they want to have right to basic services. They want to have their rights protected. And ultimately, I think they'd like to have some sort of element of the international community keeping an eye on the situation so that ultimately the military junta in Myanmar doesn't, again, abuse the rights of the Rohingya. All those things are not on the table from this military junta in Naypyidaw. They're sending delegations to come talk, but it's all about a show trying to say that Myanmar is serious when quite clearly they're not prepared to put anything on the table that would entice the Rohingya to go back.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Thanks so much for joining us today, Phil Robertson from Human Rights Watch.